very pleased to be able to introduce Melissa Ziobro. I heard her speak at Brookdale College sometime last year. She did a wonderful job. Melissa received an MA in United States history from Monmouth University. She's been teaching history at her alma mater since 2007, and recently launched a program to conduct oral history interviews of the university's student veterans. She also works on the Executive Council of Brookdale Community College Center for World War II Studies and Conflict Resolution in Lincroft, New Jersey. She previously served as a command historian at the U.S. Army Communications Center, Life Cycle Management at Fort Monmouth, because that's now closed. She lectures and publishes regularly. Her presentation this evening will be based upon her published article, Skirted Soldiers, the Women's Army Corps, and Gender Integration of the U.S. Army during World War II, as published in the prestigious military magazine On Point. Now, before I ask Melissa to come up, I did overlook one thing. I want to ask Myron Katz to come up for 1 second. He is going to tell us a little thing about Korea that we should know about.
Yeah.
And he made a suggestion tonight that I think is a good one, that we should commence our programs with saluting the flag. And I'm going to ask him to lead us in that. Come on up.
Okay, first of all, I just want to comment.
Myron, Mr. Mike.
Oh, sorry. Just a reminder of history. I'm reading this because I want to tell everything correctly. Just 2 months ago, on July 27th, the war ended in Korea, 60 years ago. I'll never forget it. Why? I was stationed in North Korea that day, firing an 81mm mortar. We hugged our fellow vets, saluted the flag, and thank God we were going home. Sadly, my 81mm mortar affected my hearing, so I'm a disabled combat vet with a hearing problem. And I also had 4 other relatives serve there. 2 were wounded in battle. Another was a veteran like me. He got discharged, but he had war-related problems. So I just wanted to pass that on to you. We were here for the Second World War. We should never forget Korea, Vietnam, and all the other wars, and to be proud as Americans. My selection of saluting the flag, will everybody please stand? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice. Thank you, Mark. Sure.
And now Melissa Ziobro.
As John very kindly said, my name is Melissa Ziobro. I have an MA in history from Monmouth University, where my master's thesis focused on the gender integration of the military. I then went on and for 7 years was the chief historian for the U.S. Army Communications Electronics Command at Fort Monmouth, and I now teach history at Monmouth University since, of course, Fort Monmouth has sadly closed. This semester I'm teaching the business and economic development of the United States, but I teach a variety of courses. Today, though, of course, we are here to talk about the gender integration of the Army. Now, John invited me to speak based on this one particular article that I published, Skirted Soldiers Get the Message Through. Now, this article discussed the introduction of women into the Army, of course, during World War II. But, you know, the Women's Army Corps didn't need me to come along in 2012 and write its history. You know, that had been done again and again, probably most notably immediately after the war by the Center of Military History. Maddie Treadwell was a government historian who wrote the history of the Women's Army Corps in the Army's famous Green Book series. Okay, so nobody needed a dry recitation of the facts, of women entering the military. So how then did I become involved in writing about the Women's Army Corps? I first became interested in the subject in 2005. As I said, I was the historian at Fort Monmouth. Part of my duties there included conducting research requests. So, people would call into the archive, and they would need a bit of research done. Now, it might be documentary filmmakers, it might be, people in the military. It might be family members. Often it was family members who would call us looking for information about a loved one who had served. In this particular instance, I was contacted by a woman whose mother had served at Fort Monmouth. Her mother passed away. She didn't know much about her military service, and she wanted to know more now that her mother had left us. So she called, and at first I'm thinking, well, I'm sorry, I can't help you. We don't maintain military personnel records here. They're sent to the National Archives, okay? But as some of you may know, there was a tremendous, devastating fire at the National Archives in the 70s, and huge numbers of personnel records were lost. This woman's mother's personnel records were lost. So I felt terribly. I'm thinking, what can I do for her? There's got to be something I can do for her. Her mother was here. What can I tell her about her service? So a light bulb popped on, and I said, I'm going to get out every newspaper we have from the 1940s, and I'm going to go through these newspapers by hand until I find some mention of her mother. So I get the newspapers out, and that's exactly what I started to do. Now, this story would be much better if I could remember if I found mention of her mother, but I cannot for the life of me remember if I did or not. I'd have to go back and look at the research request records. Let's say that I did find her mother. In any event, what I also found while I was looking at these old newspapers was, a real appreciation for how difficult the gender integration of the military was on a human level. I think there were a lot of portrayals of women in these newspapers that many today would say belittled the women, patronized them, objectified them, okay? Here we have a picture of a WWII. In the official Post newspaper, mind you, she's wearing short shorts and a bikini top, and she's gamely grinning for the cameras. Here we have this kind of leering comment that the WWIIs are providing plenty of atmosphere for the most popular display in the show. This caption here notes that the WWII is digging for something in her bag, and it's probably a lipstick. Here, these poor, tired WWIIs are shown rubbing their, quote, tootsies. Now, never in these newspapers did I see any reference to male soldiers' feet as tootsies, okay? So quite frankly, I'm going through these newspapers, I'm getting annoyed for these women, okay? They've volunteered to serve their country, which at the time could have been quite controversial. It was a sacrifice, and I didn't feel that they were getting the respect they deserved. But at some point, I stopped myself and I said, you know what, you're looking at these portrayals through 21st century eyes. We live in a time where, for better or for worse, a sportscaster recently in the news made a comment about a football player's girlfriend being very beautiful on the sidelines. And the sportscaster, I don't know if anyone remembers this story, but the sportscaster says something like, well, he doesn't care if he loses the game because he has this beautiful, beauty-queen girlfriend anyway. He was forced to apologize for very respectfully calling this woman beautiful. The woman herself was not upset. She was flattered. She said it was flattering. It did not upset her, it did not her family. But he was forced to apologize. In another example, President Obama, a couple months ago, he made a very, offhand comment about California's Attorney General being the best-looking Attorney General. And the media was aflutter. How dare he refer to this woman's looks? We live, for better or for worse, in this very hypersensitive culture today. And so, looking at these newspapers, I was approaching it from that angle. So, I stopped myself and I said, let's try to understand the experience these women had through their eyes. And so I really set out to write a study of the history of the gender integration of the military, not just as a series of, dates when they joined, what legislation allowed them to join, and figures, muster rolls. That had been done. But let's look at the gender integration of the military as a very human experience, as it was lived by the men and women, on the ground in the military. So that's tonight, what I look forward to sharing with you. Often you'll see on the screen in people's own words, because I think that's the best way to understand it. How the gender integration of the Army took place, how it was received on a very human, very real, very emotional level. So feel free to throw a hand up with questions at any point throughout the lecture. I'm happy for this to be an informal give and take. And then I will, of course, do a question and answer session at the end for you as well. All right? So let's go then. As I'm sure many of you know, prior to World War II, the Army occasionally used women in what society deemed these gender-appropriate roles. For example, civilian women, known as camp followers. They would do the washing and the mending for soldiers during the Revolutionary and Civil Wars, much as they had done for their men in times of peace. A few women acted as nurses during the American Revolution and continued to do so after the country gained its independence. But the Army Nurse Corps doesn't even become a part of the medical department until 1901. Now, the Nurse Corps becomes a military organization at that time, but the Army does not award nurses equal rank or equal pay, or any equal status to that of male soldiers. So, these restrictions on and disparities in the use of women, would have also pervaded civilian economic sectors at the time. So it was something that everybody kind of expected and accepted. But then, early advances in military communications, electronics technology around the turn of the 20th century started to provide the Army with additional opportunities to use women. For example, here you see Hortense Levy's application or identification papers for her role as a civilian telegraph operator. Okay? The Army used women as telephone and telegraph operators in World War I because this was something that women could do safely and that they then didn't have to spare men from the front lines to do. And so the Signal Corps during World War I recruited women from commercial telephone companies to fill this new kind of role in the military. Now, the first unit of female telephone operators to serve with the American Expeditionary Forces arrived in Paris in early 1918, and just over 200 of these women will ultimately serve in France with the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Army headquarters. The girls are nicknamed the Hello Girls. They work long hours, often in stressful locations. For example, 1st Army headquarters during active operations. If you go back in the archives, there's even one instance where the military had to forcefully evacuate female telephone operators from their headquarters after it had caught on fire. If the building catches on fire, they don't want to leave the building because they are so intent on getting the message through. So they're forcibly removed from the building when they refuse to leave their posts. The women, after they are eventually readmitted to the building, they reestablish communications within an hour. So these women are filling very, very critical roles overseas during World War I. They win all types of commendations from the chief signal officer, really validating the work that they have done. And so after the armistice, the Hello Girls, they expect that they'll get honorable discharges and veterans benefits, World War I victory medals, and no, instead, they are reminded that they were, quote, just civilians, and they are sent on their way. It's not until 1978, under President Carter, that after decades of intense lobbying, they are finally awarded veterans status, consequent, with the role that they actually played. So, despite the successful use of women by some of the services, like the Army and the Hello Girls during World War I, the Army remains more or less closed to women throughout the early 20th century. This, again, was in keeping with the norms of the time, which would have idealized a woman's places in the home. And this norm of women in the home was only reinforced, of course, during the Depression because there were fewer jobs to go around and, the men wanted those jobs. And so, the idea of a woman in an Army uniform throughout the 20s and 30s was really unfathomable. So what then made the Army enlist women during the Second World War? This unfathomable becomes a reality as the Army struggles to fulfill its wartime quotas. And there's simply not enough men to go around. By mid-1943, they're simply running out of bodies. And the Army could scarcely spare those men who are in the service for non-combat jobs, with Dwight Eisenhower remarking, "The simple headquarters of a Grant or Lee were gone forever. An army of filing clerks, stenographers, office managers, telephone operators, and chauffeurs had become essential, and it was scarcely less than criminal to recruit these needed manpower when great numbers of highly qualified women were available." So the utilization of women in some kind of women's army organization would offer the military opportunity to solve their labor shortages. This opportunity, this common sense idea that women should be used was so recognizable that you see, General George Marshall himself telling the War Department as early as November 1941, "I want a women's Army Corps right away, and I don't want any excuses." So really, it's just the basic numbers. This urgent wartime demand for bodies necessitates the use of all willing and able-bodied citizens, regardless of gender. In recruiting women, the Army really tries to convince them that they will be doing unusual and exciting work, and that it will be of great service to their nation. So how do we get the ball rolling? A Republican Congresswoman from Massachusetts, Edith Nurse Rogers, she introduces this first bill to establish the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. It's going to be an auxiliary corps at first, okay? These women will serve with the Army, not in the Army. Okay, this is a caveat that seems to be very important to people at the time. She cites two reasons for establishing a Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. One, we've got to fill the quotas. We don't have enough able-bodied men. And two, she cites an understandable, an undeniable demand from American women that they too be allowed to serve their country. And so, WWII veterans, they'll later write about how true this was, how much it truly meant to them that they too be able to do their part. So the 77th Congress does eventually establish a Women's Army Auxiliary Corps with Public Law 554 on 14 May 1942. Although there's much heated debate, if you look at the congressional records from the debates over establishing the Corps, some of the great quotes are this fear that, quote, "women generals would rush about the country dictating orders to male personnel and telling the commanding officers of posts how to run their business." There's another outraged congressman. He demands to know, who then will do the cooking, the washing, the cleaning, the humble home tasks to which every woman has devoted herself? Really, congressman, having this debate, saying these words about whether or not women should be allowed to join the military. And these objections to the idea of women joining the military were bipartisan, if you look at the records. Republicans and Democrats alike, were really concerned about what it would do to society if women were allowed to join the military. Another great quote is that this bill casts a shadow over the sanctity of the home. So they were really fired up about this. Really was a big bone of contention with a lot of people. But you know what? After much debate, of course, we do eventually get the Women's Army Corps. Who then will do the cooking, the washing, and the mending. Somebody apparently figured it out. And here we go. You can see this is one of the early WWII, the Auxiliary Corps recruitment posters. The Army becomes the first of the services to enlist women during World War II, when on May 15th, FDR signs Executive Order 9163, allowing women to serve with, not yet in, the Army. Auxiliary Corps were actually much stricter than requirements were for men. The women in the WAC had to be high school graduates between 21 and 45 years of age, between 5 and 6 feet tall, between 105 and 200 pounds, and quote, good health and character. The women underwent physical examinations, and while the requirements for women were more stringent, they received less pay than their male counterparts. So, yes, sir.
I noticed in this picture there's a couple of African American women. Was the Women's Army Corps more integrated than the male army?
No, there was of course segregation too. I do of course see darker skinned women in this photo, but there was the segregation of whites and African Americans in the Auxiliary Corps as a percentage. I believe they tried to keep the percentages similar to that of the overall Army. I'm good. I'm fine. So there you go. You've got the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. Will it be a success or will it flounder? Well, you know, the Army's demand for these women becomes voracious because it becomes immediately clear to those within the military that the women are useful, that they can serve a real purpose. When you look at the records, it's interesting to see that, contrary to what many people might expect, the higher-ups in the military, they were far more accepting of the idea of women than, say, politicians or those in the general population. They recognized that they needed these women. And so the Army's demand for WACs becomes absolutely voracious. Sergeant John T. Lowry, an Army recruiter, has this great quote: "This district has been called upon to enlist as many women as humanly possible." By December of 1942, they're sending recruiters out to local towns, to colleges, trying to muster up more women. They filled their initial quotas, and women are so successful that they want more. This recruiter is imploring women. The manpower of America is needed in the field, and women must step into the non-combatant jobs now being filled by soldiers. American women have accepted all the privileges enjoyed by men in this democracy, and now they are being called on to share some of the responsibilities. I can't conceive of the girls in our colleges refusing to follow their brothers into the service at a time like this. So they're really laying it on these recruiters. Women are successful, they need more. Such is the situation by the turn of 1943. Things are going so well that in January of 43, Congresswoman Rogers and the director of the WAC, Lavena Kohlhabi, they draft a bill to make the Auxiliary Corps a part of the Army rather than just an auxiliary. So allowing women to serve in, not just with the military. George Marshall himself, he'll sign off on the bill. It'll be introduced into the 78th Congress. Congress, again, not so easily convinced. It'll take a lot of debate, particularly because there's this ongoing slander campaign against women in the military, which we'll talk about more in a moment. There's a war going on and they want more women involved, and yet Congress is taking its sweet time debating things like, what'll be the top rank for women, or how large would the new corps be, or, they're demanding statistics on WAC pregnancy and venereal disease. Congress, the ones who are safe stateside, they're kind of really caught up in this debate about, is it okay to use women? Is it socially acceptable? And the people actually fighting the war are saying, get us more women, we need them. They are soldiers too. So very interesting. The law creating the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps expires in September of 43, and WACs can choose to transition into the newly created Women's Army Corps. Now, of course, more than 75% of the auxiliaries choose to enlist in the Women's Army Corps, which I think is really indicative of the fact that these women were not having a terrible experience. They felt that the work they were doing was meaningful, and they wanted to stay on with their military careers. If you go back and you look at the memoirs and the diaries and the letters of these women who were serving, they were convinced that what they were doing was worthwhile. One woman named Dorothy Gill, she says how much she loves the Army and what it means to her. Here, you can see this kind of cute cartoon where Private Recruit is being reminded now that because women are a part of the Army rather than just an auxiliary thereof, he is required to salute his WAC officers. So now the WACs are receiving the same pay, the same rank, and the same benefits as their male soldiers. This is a remarkable advancement of the time, given that even today women still suffer pay disparities in private industry. So it's also worth noting that the Army at the time continued to deny nurses equivalent rank and pay. And the nurse had been part of the medical department since 1901. So very quickly, the woman's role in the military goes from being an auxiliary to having this equivalent status. Let's see. So let's look a little bit about the experience women were actually having. Okay, we know they had a long, hard, debated slog to get into the military. Now they're in the military, and how is that going for them? One WAC, Elizabeth Pollock, she talks about how the women in her unit, they loved their colonel. He was great to them. And she was, having a conversation with another male officer about how nice and kind the colonel was, and gee, we WACs really like him, and they couldn't have picked a better guy for the job. And the guy she's talking to kind of barks back and says, well, he can get mad too, There was this kind of, concern amongst some of the male soldiers that they had to retain this gruff military posture and not be softened by their contact with women, which I think is kind of interesting. We see this kind of concern that some men on the ground had about, kind of keeping up their manhood, ensuring that being a soldier is still a very manly job, even if you're working next to women. And then on the other side, we see that a lot of women were very concerned with retaining their femininity. Okay, that becoming a soldier didn't mean they were any less feminine, that they were any less of a woman. And so these women are struggling to reconcile their new meaningful roles as members of the military with the very traditional gender roles to which many of them would have still adhered. Another example, a lot of my research has been spent going through the diaries and the letters of these WACs. And a great example is this one WAC named Betty Oliver. She writes home to ask for a negligee to wear on her wedding night because, quote, she wants to let her boy know that he's got a woman and not a soldier. Okay, so she's very preoccupied with maintaining her femininity there. One WAC writes, everyone around here is so terrified for fear she'll lose her femininity. I haven't heard so much talk about ladies in all my life as I had since I joined the WAC. So, even if you weren't so concerned about your nails and your hair and being feminine before, when it was assumed in civilian life that you were feminine, now that you were in the military, it was suddenly a concern. How do you juggle this new meaningful role that you've stepped into, out of the home, out of baking and cleaning, doing this very meaningful, traditionally masculine work, and yet still keeping your identity as a woman. So this is something that WACs were very preoccupied with. Now, the consternation caused by women joining the military can't be understated. There were many people, both in and out of the Army, who objected to women's new roles. You see, women in the military could face a lot of disdain, both in the military and at home. There are a lot of women who talk about how they had to go home and change out of their uniform before they got there when they were on leave because their parents were embarrassed to say that their daughter were a soldier. Now, here's another quote Emma Love says, I just about killed my mother when I said I was going to join the WAC. They tell me that after I got over there, she cried for 6 months because she was so embarrassed. Another WAC writes, it was a disgrace to join the military. If you were a woman, it just wasn't the thing that was done. He, her father, was terrified of what the neighbors would say if they found out. There's another WAC. And she writes extensively about the ugly rumors that persisted about these women. And said that her family was terrified to discuss her service with anyone who would then, automatically assume that they were of these morals, that they had to have that would encourage them to put themselves amongst men in this way. So this slander campaign that's going on against the WWII, it's not just idle gossip. It gained such notoriety during the war that a whole bevy of figures will be enticed to address it, from First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt to Edith Nurse Rogers, the congresswoman who introduced the WWII legislation. They are going to attack this slander campaign against women as a, quote, Nazi-inspired attempt to undermine the American war effort. Okay, this is in writing. Secretary of War Henry Stimson even gets in on it, saying, quote, "My attention has been attracted to sinister rumors aimed at destroying the reputation of WWII. I refer to charges of immorality. I wish to state," now this is the Secretary of War having to take time to address this, "I wish to state that these rumors are absolutely and completely false. I emphasize, I have myself made a thorough investigation of these rumors and they are completely false." George Marshall himself will be forced to issue press releases on the issue. I mean, just crazy if you think about what these men were dealing with as far as the prosecution of the war goes, and they're forced to address this slander campaign against the WWII. So, whether it was actually Nazi-inspired or domestic in origin, this slander campaign against the WWII is real, and it persists even into the post-war period. There are many accounts of WWIIs who, in the post-war period, change their resumes so that they don't mention their service in the military. They'll just say they were a clerk typist or something kind of vague, because they are afraid that potential employers will hold it against them, think they are of loose morals, think they may have a disease of some sort because they served in the military. So veteran status, which was often a good thing for men, handicapped many women in the post-war period, and it's quite sad. So these cruel innuendos about women really devalue their service, and that's a very kind of sad consequence of these very meaningful contributions that the women made. Now, how did women deal with this? Because there's a war going on. Well, by and large, when you look at the historical records and the narratives, women, they did not allow it to get them down. They addressed the rumors and denounced them and went along their business. It was a joke to a lot of women. Just another thing that they were going to let roll off their backs. They were not going to get it down. Again, some great quotes from women addressing the issue in their own words. Of any negativity she encountered, any what today would be called, discrimination or sexual harassment. She says, "Women in my life had always been treated differently. My treatment in the Army was actually much more liberating than anything I encountered in my civilian life, comparatively speaking. I thought the Army was pretty great. Given the context of the time, I still do." There are other women who've written, yes, some women whistled and made catcalls, but we were used to it. This was a part of our lives at the time. We laughed it off and we went on our way. One corporal tries to make a joke of it. She says, "Yes, the soldiers whistle at me and I just whistle at them right back." Another soldier, again, kind of using humor as a defense mechanism. She says, "I feel that I was slipping if I didn't collect a few whistles every day." And so, many of these women serving in the military, they saw the opportunities afforded to them by their service as worth, any of the negatives that they encountered, be it from the civilian population who looked down on them or questioned their morality, or be it, from troops within the military who, might have treated them, unfortunately, the way women in 1940s America expected to be treated. That's not to say that it's right. It's to say that this is the world that they lived in at that time. Now, some women actually applauded gender relations in the military. Elizabeth Pollock writes in her diary, "I was delighted to see that men don't resent the WWII, but really like and admire us." Another WWII writes, "The fellow whose job I'm taking is a peach of a guy. He's so patient and nice to me, just a heck of a good fellow." So whether they actually applauded, their experience working with men in the military or not, by and large, the overwhelming number of women who wrote about their military service have agreed that they did not regret it. They had no regrets. Let's see some examples of women's testimony here. I know I am doing something to help the boys come home. Like most of my contemporaries, I wasn't much impressed by the thought of women in uniform. Today, I've been completely converted. I'd say that a WWII is a good deal more efficient than any all-male outfits I could name. There are no better soldiers on earth. This coming, of course, from one of the male contemporaries of the women. So, many women looked back on their experience with pride, okay? Whether they were able to declare that pride publicly or not. And that's really encapsulated in their diaries, in their letters, in their oral histories, with quotes like, "I am proud to wear the WWII uniform. I guess I love about everything that goes with it." Another quote, "Now I know where I belong." Another quote, "No matter how complicated the process may be, the Army always comes through in the end." And perhaps my favorite, "Maybe I sound like Pollyanna, but I really felt that it was a very fair Army." So when we, in the 21st century, look back on, the treatment of women, the use of women in the military during World War II, we have to remember, that whether or not we think it was fair, many women at the time took any battles they encountered in stride, enjoyed their experience, and emerged through it, happy and pleased that they had been able to do their part, to support their country. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Yes, ma'am.
The newspapers filled with always stories of sexual harassment and attacks in many branches of the Army, particularly the prestigious service academies. How much progress do you really think women have made being in the service now in the 21st century?
And one caveat would be that my study addressed the overall experience of women. So this paper did not delve into any instances of, say, rape during the World War II period. But of course, sexual harassment, sexual discrimination, rape is something that is a very hot topic for the military today. It was just within the past week or two, wasn't it, that I believe the history department chair at one of the service academies was removed for sexual harassment. You have people in the military who are in charge of the sexual harassment training being relieved of duty for sexual harassment. So I think, sadly, while society has, come so far, for some reason, we've not seen the same progress among the rank and file of the military. Yes, sir.
You want to wait till I get the microphone for you so everybody can enjoy your question?
Sure. Yeah, how were the women integrated at the unit level? And how were the women officers, given the ranks, put into place? There obviously was no women officers before 1940.
There weren't billets specifically earmarked for women because prior to World War II, women weren't serving. And so how it starts initially is men being taken out of non-combat jobs, okay? And as they're sent to combat, then women fill in to those positions. That's initially where the impetus for women came from, and that's how women will primarily be used. So there aren't billets specifically earmarked for women. They're filling the positions as those men are mustered out and shipped overseas. Yes, sir?
Want to wait for the microphone, please?
I'll let John be in charge.
I want everybody to hear this very important question.
It's not important, but I'd like to know what was the highest rank of the Women's Army Corps during World War II?
Hobby, and
I know she was a colonel.
Yes, I don't believe during the
She was at
war.
my college.
I'm sorry?
She came from my college.
Oh, okay, so you asked a question and answered it for me. Thank you very much, ma'am. So no, I don't believe she ever surpassed, as the director of the WWII, she didn't ever surpass the rank of colonel during the war. Okay.
Hi, could you speak a little to the role the WWII had in delivering airplanes by flying them across country and how it evolved WWII?
Women's involvement specifically in.
They were actually flying delivering the airplanes to bases from the factories.
Absolutely. This would have been, one of the non-combatant roles. Test pilots, mechanics, involving vehicles as well. Airplane mechanics, and then also wasn't even this, of course, focused on the American military, but even the Queen of England, right, was a mechanic during the war. So again, these non-combatant jobs that women could fulfill. They wouldn't have been combat pilots, but they could have worked on, the aircraft in non-combatant roles. Yes, sir.
It just strikes me that would have been a prestigious thing for a woman to do, and not, did they like get the volunteer for that, or they put in for that position?
They were given the same aptitude tests and things that men would have had. So, they were assigned based on their individual skill sets and trainings. But again, they needed somebody to fulfill those jobs, and so you could train a woman to do it. The funny thing about mechanics and also communications and electronics equipment is that there are a lot of people, and this persisted in the civilian industry too, who said that women were particularly adaptable to working with tiny parts for a few reasons. They had smaller fingers, and they were perceived to have more patience than men. So they could work with, this small and sometimes taxing equipment. So that's something, that the historic record actually proves. Women and their tiny fingers were better suited, to working in military communications, electronics fields, or any fields where this small, intricate work needed to be done.
Besides flying them to bases, I always thought that they flew them from the States to England before the invasion. Is that right? Am I wrong about that?
Honestly, I'm not sure of that. I won't speculate on that. I always tell my students, your instructors are not boundless fonts of knowledge, and if I do not know the answer to something, I will admit that. I don't know if they flew transatlantic flights. Can anybody else verify that?
They did.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you would take a moment and just address where we are at the end of this linear progression in 2013, where women are now in the Army being trained for combat. Women in the Marines are being trained for combat. Is this a goal that you approve of, or what is your sense of this?
I would rather not address my personal opinion on the matter. What I will say is that much to-do has been made about, women can be in combat now. Well, quite frankly, women have been in combat for quite some time. While that might not technically have been their MOS, women have been driving convoys, that are going through, hostile areas and being bombed and subject to IED attacks. So, I mean, women are allowed in combat now. Well, women have been, in combat de facto for quite some time. So I'd rather not say if personally I agree with that, but if that is the end game of the progression that started with, World War I, World War II, then we're there. But women have been in combat for quite some time.
The moderator has a question.
Yes, sir.
In my 4 years in the service, I saw what I would call sexual harassment, which was swept under the rug continually. Nowadays in the Army, the slightest hint of that kind of thing can cost a general his entire career. Would you want to comment on that? What happened in those early days, and who was responsible for the covering up or pushing aside?
Yeah, again, it's so much a product of what's going on in society at the time. And what are the societal norms? We're not talking about what's right and wrong. We're just talking about what the societal norms were at the time. And so you couldn't really have expected the Army of World War II to have these strict, written regulations against sexual harassment, because sexual harassment wasn't even a word. It wasn't something that people would talk about at the time. As we move forward, and gratefully, society makes these gains. You would expect the military to transform accordingly, but for whatever reason, that's above my pay grade. They've got think tanks trying to figure out why this is such an institutional problem in the military. For whatever reason, it is still a very real problem. The military has not kept up with the societal norms.
Two questions. What did you say the height requirements were for the women to become wax?
Initially with the auxiliary corps, it was 5 foot to 6 foot, and then they may have required them to be a little taller with the Women's Army Corps. I'd have to refer to my notes.
And the second point was, why was there such a debate in Congress about bringing women in to do certain formerly male roles, when the private sector had adopted it? I mean, Rosie the Riveter, women working in Air Force, airplane, and tank factories, doing all sorts of roles that men had traditionally done because the men weren't there, but someone still had to do them.
Absolutely. A few things I'll say about that. If you see a lot of pictures of, Rosie the Riveter type pictures, these women still have a full face of makeup on in many cases, still have their hair done, still have their nails perfectly painted. Again, so it was about, even though these women are entering in the civilian sector, a traditionally male role, there's a preoccupation with retaining your femininity. Now, if I'm going to speculate on, there was an intense debate in Congress. There's no question about that. You can look at the record of what was being said in Congress. So there was this intense debate. If I'm to speculate on why that was, I think it's because being a soldier, being in the military is the most, stereotypically masculine thing you could do. And so that's why it would have been, that much more, confusing or concerning to people. Also, consider in the factories. By and large, would there have been men in these factories? There would have been some, but a lot of them would have been drafted, would have been going to the war. So, they're not rubbing elbows with men as much. Whereas in the military, they are more forced to, work closely with the men, which then leads to concerns about promiscuity and pregnancy and venereal disease that we see discussed in the records.
Did the wax receive the same veterans benefits as the male?
They did.
Since when?
Just a
Just a quick question. What were the numbers? Sorry, what were the numbers in terms of women in World War II in the wax and percentage-wise against the men?
Percentage, I'm not sure off the top of my head. I believe it was about 420,000 women that participated. I would double check as soon as our discussion here is done and give you a definite answer. Yes, ma'am.
What was their role in intelligence? Were they hired as spies like the British and French did?
I have not seen evidence. I'm trying to think. I've read, gosh, so many dozens of memoirs over the years. Nothing's popping into my head about women working espionage roles. Can anybody else speak to that? You're all avid World War II readers. I don't believe. Yeah.
There was in the Bill Donovan's OSS. There were some women who served as cryptographers and things like that.
Okay, but actually deploying behind enemy lines.
Okay.
Julia Child?
It was British. It was a movie where she went to Germany.
In your research, have you ever gotten into the experience in the Israeli army where women have been in combat roles for a long, long time?
I'm not. It's really focused specifically on this crux, this truly in American military.
So the Israeli idea
a global
of the
comparison.
Let me just follow up on a couple of items here. Let me just throw some observations on this.
Well, first of all, just from a personal experience during World War II, my father was in the service, and I used to go down on weekends to spend time with him down at Fort Dix. Now, the nurse corps was accepted and certainly a role model for women in the service. And then I trained at Tripoli, Hawaii. Commanding general at that time was a survivor of the Japanese prison camps,
when the Great Depression,
two-star general.
And as a result,
about 50 years later, just as a memory thing, commanding general was a nurse, and I flipped.
Generally, it's agreed that there's not as much
One of the problems
resistance
they ran into
to the
is
nurse
that
corps
when women
because
were
nursing is a
serving
more
in
traditionally
combat
feminine role of
and
caring
men
for
were
people.
poor.
There are of course concerns about women seeing men's
men
unclothed bodies,
felt
but traditionally,
natural
caring for people's feminine role. And so a lot of historians agree that that is why there is less consternation over the idea of military nurses.
We all know that there was a loss of life in the Army Nurse Corps. Was there any loss of life in the WACs?
Were there any WAC casualties during the war? There were. I don't have specific statistics, but there were. And that again goes to this idea of, okay, women in combat, women were just allowed in combat recently. But you don't have to be in combat, to have instances where women are fighting or losing their lives in the execution of their duties. So yes, definitely loss of life. By
Okay,
that.
1 or 2 more questions. Melissa has a long ride back to Tom's River. We thank her for coming. Any more questions? One more.
You mentioned that there was a percentage of people. I was wondering about the African American percentage in the World War II. What was that percentage?
Overall percentage of African Americans that served in World War II?
Yes.
Again, I don't have the exact number off the top of my head. Anybody? I'm happy to share. It was a smaller percentage.
All right, thank you very much, Melissa. How about a nice round for Melissa? Very nice job.
I thank you for letting me speak to you. Again, if we're going to talk about percentages, if you look at the current population, less than 1% will serve in the military today. If you take the population and look at everybody that's a veteran that's ever served, it's less than 5% of the population. So I know there are many veterans among us. I thank you all for your service, and I thank you for allowing me to speak to you today. Thank you.